Okay, officially good afternoon, everyone. I'm Colonel Roxanne Towner-Watkins, and I have War Hamster Brady with me today, reformed Wall Street banker, for part 2 of our BCCI uncovered operation using our Gladio glasses. And what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to go a little bit deeper into some of the characters that were caught up in the BCCI scandal and see where that takes us.
Okay, and who do you want to start with first?
Real quick, I'm just looking for the Rumble live feed so I can see the chat, and I do not see it on your page. Are we live there? Or
yeah, it usually takes a couple of minutes for it to feed over.
Okay, I'll just keep an eye on it. I like reading the chat. Oh, there we go. Probably ought to mute that so we don't get the echo. Where do we want to start? Well, we covered a big umbrella of the BCCI scandal and a lot of surrounding characters and players last week. We didn't do a whole lot of in-depth on some of them, and I kind of wanted to focus on 3 names, people that were caught up in the investigation. As we talked about last week, they sort of deliberately put a pretty low bar on how high up the food chain they were going to go. But the names they did get are pretty fascinating. I'll start you with a fun one. This guy by the name of Robert Altman. And if Hollywood buffs will know who he is, he was actually the husband of the 1970s Wonder Woman, Linda Carter, which is a real fun coincidence. He was the chair of the Democrat Party in 1982, and Mondale tried to name him the chair of the DNC nationally. He got caught up in it because he was named, for whatever reason, the president of First American Bank, which is one of the banks that BCCI illegally had taken control of. So I thought that was a funny story about, a guy, Hollywood producer. He's like an honorary guy to the Hollywood Hall of Fame. I guess his biggest thing on his IMDb page is he was a producer of the original movie MASH.
So can I just suggest that that's not like a coincidence? Because obviously in Gladio fashion, when we know that the CIA is embedded in Hollywood, would it strike anybody as weird that you have basically what I refer to as a CIA front bank, BCCI, and they would tap someone out of Hollywood, which I think is another cesspool of CIA assets, to kind of join forces?
I'm going to accept your suggestion 100%. When I talk about Hollywood and its ties to everything, and I think you get a lot of this from, oh, darn it, how did I just forget her name? I'll think of it in a second. I've got to walk over to my bookshelf and remember her name. You got to look at the mafia ties to the Cleveland Mafia, and basically the Jewish Mafia they were working hand in hand with are really the founders of the Hollywood. And you go back to the 1920s, and Jewish producers couldn't get any money or jobs. They were completely ostracized from movie production. So they took some Cleveland Mafia and Jewish Mafia money, went to Hollywood and started their own gig and did it better. Those Mafia connections have never left. And of course, you've already done a really good job of tracing the Mafia connections to intelligence. So we don't need to repeat that.
Yeah, we've got quite a few of them. As a matter of fact, it's my hypothesis that the beauty of World War II allowed the international syndicate to take all of their former intelligence assets that were outside the government, the mafia, the agents within the international syndicate, the bankers, all of them, and fold them into the CIA. Because it's not coincidental that OSS, in the precursor to the exploitation of all of this vast worldly destabilized country in the quote unquote Cold War, was filled with lawyers, bankers, successful businessmen under the guise of an intelligence agency called the OSS. And also social was kind of their nickname. And so you have these people infiltrated all over the world, and all of their locations ends up being the places that we destabilize later. Korea, Vietnam, China, Turkey, all of them.
Yeah, I'm going to jump to one of my favorite quotes because he just kind of teed it up. But one of the gentlemen we've talked about is Meyer Lansky. And of course, he dies penniless in Florida. He was shunned by Israel. But Lansky was involved in all of that going back like 5 or 6 decades. And his quote, one of the last things he's ever recorded saying is, "I learned it was easier and more profitable to steal money from people legally than it was to do it illegally."
Correct.
And that's why you get the bankers and the lawyers, the investment bankers.
Because it is a countrywide theft. When they went into Chile and overthrew the government, it was a countrywide theft that they had access then with their stooge, Pinochet in the government. They had access to everything. It wasn't going in and competing on an equal basis with a home country and their workforce. It was install a dictator, steal everything that they have, and imprison the population to work as slaves.
Cheap and free labor and cheap resources that's the underlying goal of this whole thing. It became very obvious centuries ago that military conquest is not a very good investment. We kind of hopefully put that to rest, in the middle of the 20th century. They've definitely decided that their goals haven't changed. It's just the means that they use. And now instead of using a bayonet or gunpowder, it's done quite often with ones and zeros on a computer.
And a combination of both. So you have the paramilitary hiding that is orchestrated through NATO and the CIA and other intelligence agencies. So when you need that kinetic power, you have it. But the grand theft and the grand imperialist initiatives is done, as you said, through the computerized overall theft. But going back to Altman, one of the most fascinating things, and my middle daughter and I, she's the one that works on editing the Substack and stuff. So she reads all of the material that I put out. And she's a lead guitarist in a band, and she's very much into the whole music industry. She found all of that information very fascinating about Laurel Canyon and the mafia and all that other stuff. But when I got around to Robert Altman, the thing that struck me the most, only because I know how hypnotized and brainwashed our children are with video games, is he was a video game executive. Now, this guy that embeds himself in CIA, mafia, Los Angeles, Southern California, empire of evil, is also in with the CIA in orchestrating the infiltration of a foreign bank, illegally purchasing U.S. banks to money launder and spy on Congress. And he's an executive in video games?
I get the lingering question there. It makes a lot of sense.
I mean, again, these people that come out of this BCCI environment is just, to me, it became the biggest ball of yarn that, as it continued to roll down from 1972 through the decades into the 1990s, was made up of the who's who of the underbelly of the world. There's no one not mentioned in the story.
Well, it's because it's been going on for a long time. BCCI was just a chapter in a bigger story. They've always needed financial institutions to monetize the transfer of funds to commit illicit acts, whether it be criminal or espionage. That's always been the case. Now, BCCI came around at a really strange period in history because we're going through deregulation. Thatcher and Reagan were really happy to deregulate markets. Well, that turned the whole financial system into a casino. I talked last week about how the city of London rose back from the dead in the late 70s and in the 80s because of deregulation. And basically, the regulators, and there are some good regulators out there, as we see in this story. Well, the American regulators couldn't do anything in London because it was off our shores. And the British regulators couldn't do anything because it was being transacted in US dollars. That was the euro dollar history. And that's the deregulation that Reagan and Thatcher left us with, which it basically took all the brakes off of what was previously a somewhat regulated industry and made it a lot easier to get away with anything. And BCCI comes in there and opens up its doors, and everybody was signing up at the casino.
Well, and they purposely signed up all of the CIA installed dictators around the world.
Yeah, I don't know if, I think they've kind of happened. BCCI was started before the CIA got involved about a year 2 or 3 there. BCCI was around for a few years before CIA decided to use it as a conduit. So they had some nefarious goals before. Well, that's assuming that the CIA did not have its thumb on everything in the Middle East at that point in time,
Okay. And so I don't know that that's an accurate assumption.
Go for it.
And the only reason that I would test that assumption is because of where it was set up. Now, because of Pakistan. Pakistan was set up, as we all know, after World War II as a completely fictional country. And the infiltration of the government of Pakistan and their military and their intelligence services dates way back at its beginning. So the fact that you have a very well-groomed, well-educated in Western schools, a Betty, a banker in India who relocates to Pakistan, as did the majority of the Muslims when they set up Pakistan. I don't know. I understand the story they put together, but I'm not sure that story is the story.
I think that's a reasonable doubt you're putting out there. And I'm basing that 3 years into the BCCI because that's as far as back as we can actually document it from what I've been able to pull up. And I think if we really want to go look at the origins, we have to look deeper into the UAE, United Arab Emirates, because that's where the money really came from for the Pakistani bank. And that's where the ownership ended up. But that's not today's show. So let's not get too off the rails on that. It would be something for us to make a joint project because chicken and egg sometimes matters.
And I do think, like we talked, next show, we're going to look at some of the players in the Middle East. And I do think diving into that a little bit more would be well worth it. Just to kind of, here's what my stated goals are. His idea was creating a third bank or a third world bank and do all of these philanthropic things. And yet his foundation didn't do any of those philanthropic things. As a matter of fact, all of the people that ended up banking with BCCI was taken advantage of. So the premise of the bank was a lofty, feel-good thing that was 100% a lie. But anyway, so is there anything else that you wanted to add on Altman? Because I do find it, as you mentioned, the fact that he married Linda Carter, very interesting. And also, even after all of this scandal, he ends up on an advisory board at George Washington Law School. So George Washington University comes up in many of my Operation Gladio. Obviously, he's a graduate of Harvard Law School, which seems to be a CIA recruiting tool. Yale School graduate. So he followed in the line of many of our CIA aspiring culprits, both during the OSS time and in the CIA, like I'd say first 15 years. He has a very similar background.
Yeah, and where's George Washington University located?
Right in the heart of evil.
It is right across the Potomac, for those who don't know.
Yeah.
All right, let's skip over to our next character of interest. One of the people who did get caught up in the net. It's a gentleman by the name of Bert Lance, Who's Bert Lance? Well, he was the guy who introduced Jimmy Carter to BCCI's founder, Abedi. That's Bert Lance for you. He's also the guy famously for coining the phrase in government, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So what did he do for Carter? He was the director of the OMB. And I think it's worth doing a quick screen share to see exactly how powerful a position that is. So let me pull that up real quick. It's the Office of Budget and Management. And what do they do? It's for budget development and execution. So basically controlling federal budgets. It's kind of powerful. It's management, including oversight of agency performance. Procurement, financial management, and information technology. It's coordination and review of all significant federal regulations from executive agencies, privacy policy, information policy, and review and assessment of information collection requests. Sounds like to me he's like one of those people that's a bottleneck position for a lot of information and money.
And having been at the seat of government for 6 years, I can tell you that the OMB has visibility into everything.
And that's this guy for Carter in the 70s when all the shenanigans are going on. He also covers clearance and coordination of legislative and other materials, including agency testimony, legislative proposals, and other communications with Congress in coordination of other presidential actions. That is a really broad sweeping paragraph. And lastly, it's clearance of presidential executive orders and memoranda to agency heads prior to their issuance. So basically, he's the mouthpiece and a lot of other things for the office of the president. So this is not a small player. So you got to figure he's one of the 4 or 5 most powerful people in the executive branch. And yet he is the guy who later would introduce Jimmy Carter to the head of the world's sleaziest bank. I don't think that's it. I think that's pretty significant.
Correct.
So how did he get involved? Well, he became the chairman of the Calhoun First National Bank of Georgia. Carter brought a lot of Georgia old boys with him to the White House, and they're going to keep popping up. He was involved in deals with Abedi, of course, with BCCI. He was also involved in deals with a guy by the name of Mokhtar Riyadi. Mokhtar is an Indonesian financial magnate. He founded something called a Lippo Group that was really involved in real estate, banking, and education. I highlight the education because we did a show not long ago about how, not Jeffrey Epstein, but Robert Maxwell, how he had basically monopolized the education printing business.
Yep.
So this is kind of being played out in Indonesia, but Mokhtar was a very, very powerful guy in Indonesia.
And it's important to note that in Indonesia, we, of course, couped the government to steal all of their resources, too.
And what year was that?
That was in the mid part of the 60s, just before BCCI set up in 72.
And Mokhtar Riyadi would come to power right after that coup.
Yes. So
he's definitely a shady individual. Another guy that Bert Lance is affiliated with was a guy by the name of Gaith Pharaon, spelled Pharaon. This guy's a Saudi fugitive, was a Saudi fugitive financier. He acquired 2 of the banks for BCCI in America. And remember, there's a rule against foreigners owning U.S. banks. They can't have, back then, I think you can own over less than 15% of ownership could be foreign. So Gaith is pretty well connected in Saudi Arabia. His father was actually the advisor to King Faisal back in the days.
And before you leave the Lippo thing, there's a whole connection of Riyadi with Clinton. So just know that's there too. Go ahead.
So Lippo's got a Clinton connection because I don't have that on my notes.
Oh my gosh, it's huge.
Okay. Well, you want to dive into that right now, or?
No, it is something that we could do a whole show on the Riyadi Clinton because it involves Mark Middleton and his untimely death. They were all, Riyadi basically was a source of income that brought Clinton to fame.
Okay. So basically, he's the kingmaker.
Yeah.
That's a bigger player than I give him credit for, so I appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to hear that. So going back to Saudi, we've got the guy whose father was the advisor to the King Faisal. He formed a company called REDEC, REDEC, which is the largest private enterprise in the Middle East at the time. He's the guy that purchased National Bank of Georgia from Bert Lance, and that eventually would become the BCCI, one of their first purchases in America. He is wanted as a fugitive by the FBI for years, but yet he still got U.S. military contracts to supply jet fuel in the Middle East. So we get a guy who's on the run from the FBI, yet our government is still contracting with him for the Pentagon's purposes.
And understand that his company was the timing of the discovery of oil, and he was basically what we think of as the Bin Laden family construction empire. He was it before Bin Laden family. He had all of the contracts to build Mecca and Medina. He left them in a cesspool, but he basically took all of the money. He's running around the Middle East during all of the oil money is rushing in, collecting paychecks to build projects that in many cases were subpar or didn't get done at all. So it's just a big, large money laundering operation.
Yeah, it's amazing how the deeper you go in this stuff, it involves so many different aspects of the economy and society. And it's just a group of people playing above the rules. They are pirates of commerce, and they have captured a lot of our governments.
And a lot of our money.
Indeed. And that's one of the things, 30,000 foot view. A lot of people always say, follow the money. And yeah, that's a great way to find out who are the culprits. And I'm a big believer in follow the money. But at the end of the day, it's not the money that they're after. It's the power and the resources, because money is downstream from the power and the resources. Control. And that's the game these people play. It's the control. Exactly. And, you control real estate. You control the resources. You get a hold of a government. Then you can call it democracy all you want. But if you own the politicians, it's not a very democratic system.
And keep in mind that that's the end state of much of this laundered money is real estate. So there's no industry that is left untouched. So they buy legitimate businesses like nursing homes here in the United States, where they know because of the Medicare fraud that they're going to always have a return on their investment. You can find large chains of senior living that they used as a money laundering legitimate business. So they send it into the BCCI banks, wash it, it comes out clean, and they buy legitimate businesses here. And part of the problem in bringing this down is when you look around at they owned the entire city of Cleveland just about under the Ukrainian money laundering apparatus. Yeah, when you start looking around, and I would venture half of Miami would fail, because Miami was one of their gold spots during this entire time in parking laundered money in real estate.
Yeah, well, have I talked about in your show before how the National Association of Realtors has lobbied for decades to make sure that realtors have an anti-money laundering exemption?
You mentioned it last week, but please say that again, because this is so important. My mouth dropped when you said that.
Yeah, the National Association of Realtors, has been lobbying successfully for decades. They don't have any know your customer rules. They have an anti-money laundering exemption. If you're a banker, financial advisor, or anybody in financial services, we've got KYC, know your customer rules. We get trained on this stuff. We need to spot where the money comes from. That's not the case in real estate. And that's why Florida real estate has been the money laundering mecca for decades. So the cocaine, it led to the savings and loan scandal. All of that ties together. But why are our nice little friendly realtors? They don't have to care where the money comes from.
And so much of the real estate is cash buyers. Hello.
Yeah, it's not just Blackstone, people.
There's a lot of cash buyers in Florida.
Yeah, I would imagine. I don't know if there's, I don't know how much cash buying is done in California, but it was more than I expected. Funny side note, when my parents left Oregon to move to San Diego when I was still in high school, the buyer of their house was like an acre and a quarter with the horses and everything like that. It was a nice property, old house. Um, was cash purchased by a descendant of the Carnegie Trust, which when I was in high school, I thought that was really cool. And then I found out who the Carnegie is all about, and I'm a little ticked off that they got to be in my childhood home. But back to Mr. Lance. So, we're talking about Guyeth Parion. Another side note about him is his business partner was a guy by the name of Kadal Adham, Adham.
Mm-hmm.
And he's popped up on your radar before, I'm sure, because he was the former head of Saudi intelligence.
Yes.
So he goes say
that again.
So with the former head of Saudi intelligence, partners with a fugitive financier who does business with Bert Lance, who's the guy who introduced Jimmy Carter, the president, to the head of the dirtiest bank in history, as he's running the OMB, one of the most powerful offices in America.
And so just to reiterate this, that's the Saudi version of the CIA.
Yes. And they are vicious, by the way. They do not have the kind of the civilized restraint that our intelligence agencies generally will show in domestic issues.
Okay, well, wait, in domestic. But but hold on. I'm going to kind of push that one because our CIA blew up former ambassador Adelader, how do you say his name? Latieri from Chile in downtown DC. I'm not sure we actually have any of it. I just don't know that we know the extent of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd use the word domestically for a reason, because I don't put anything past our CIA once it crosses our borders.
But they've done it here. That's what I just said.
To some degree, yeah. And we're seeing more of it lately. They've escalated. And by the way, remind me, isn't their original charter in the 1947 National Security Act prohibit the CIA from operating on U.S. soil?
Like in killing a president?
Yeah, well, you're not supposed to do that either.
Yeah, they've operated here the entire time, like drugging the people in MK Ultra out in San Francisco, Jim Jones, all of that stuff. Yeah, there's been some very ugly history. Most people don't associate it with the CIA, but we have.
Correct. I guess, though, I should probably rephrase what I said about the Saudi intelligence. They do it openly. They do not try it. They don't try to hide it.
All right, I'm going to accept that.
Thank you. Gosh darn. This is less of a educational show, more like hanging out with a friend over a beer.
That's the way it's supposed to be. Okay.
Right. So that's Mr. Guyeth Parion, and of course he's got to purchase the National Bank of Georgia from Lance. Okay, I got all that. So Lance sells the National Bank of Georgia shares the exact same day that Abedi had paid off Lance's $3.5 million loan at First National Bank of Chicago. First National Bank of Chicago. The same day, the BCCI pays off his own personal loan for $3.5 million. Lance would sell the National Bank of Georgia to this group of Saudis, which is basically a front for BCCI. Other thing that Mr. Parion did was he's the guy who, First National Bank of Chicago was making huge loans at the time to the Soviet Union. Now, this is Cold War days, so think about that. We have an American bank making loans during the Cold War to the Soviet Union that's affiliated with a guy who's the OMB director for the United States while getting in bed with BCCI and Saudi intelligence agents. Any questions there? Yeah.
So let me just reemphasize this. What time frame are we talking?
This is 1978.
And how many countries are we in the middle of overthrowing because we're claiming they're communist simply because they're purchasing weapons and doing business transactions with the USSR that we're loaning money to?
Yeah, and I can't think of anything but Iran. That's when 1978 and 79, I think about the Iran situation.
Oh, but there's so many more.
Yeah,
it was basically the entire South America, Central America crowd that were going country by country overthrowing, because Allende was in 1972 in Chile.
I didn't have this pulled up here, but I actually have a list. I got to do this for you next week. I'll bring it, but a list of all the coups in world history.
Yes, I've seen it.
Well, it's really funny. You go from 00 to 1000 AD. You got a lot of coups, maybe, probably 30 or 40 for that 1,000-year period. You get a few more into the 20th century, up to, 10,000 AD to about the turn of the 20th century. All of a sudden, sometime right around 1947, the coups start happening with an amazing amount of regularity. And I can't put my finger on what changed.
You mean like the creation of the worldwide intelligence network?
That's got to be a coincidence, Colonel.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah, it really does. I should probably leave the sarcasm at home for those people who don't know me. I get a little bit dry.
Yeah, they all know. But I just wanted to go here real quick, since we're talking about this. If you look up, let's see. Let me get up to the 70s. There's so many. I have a whole list of them here. It's crazy how many there are.
I'm going with 87 that America has pulled. I think we can probably.
So, and I stopped counting at 80, so I just feel comfortable saying over 80. So Bolivia was in 71. We had Chile right before Bolivia. We have Ethiopia. We have Angola. In 75, we began secretly doing them. We have East Timor, Argentina. We go into Afghanistan in 79. So yeah, there's several. And that's just off the top of my head. So go ahead.
I was trying to pull it up here, but yeah, there's a lot. And yeah, the 70s were a mess. 80s were a mess. 60s weren't very good.
And that's not even counting the ones we did, like you just said, in the 60s that now have a dictator in that we're washing money through them and stealing all of their resources.
Yeah, and we call them dictators. That's a media term. What you're basically looking at is a strong-armed puppet for American interests who is willing to give American multinational companies cheap deals on the resources, keep the labor cheap, so they can, basically enrich themselves and their cronies in their country. And generally speaking, when they get toppled, if they will inevitably get toppled because these are corrupt systems, they will have their money and it'll move elsewhere into an offshore bank, into some kind of tax haven.
You mean like BCCI? Because they all had accounts there?
It's amazing. And they were doing it before BCCI, though. The same stuff was going on.
Yeah, I know. But every single one of them was made to have an account at BCCI. Yeah, like Noriega, Saddam Hussein, all of them were made, all of their strong-arm dictators were made to have an account at BCCI because it made funneling the money easier.
Yeah, into this environment, we decided to deregulate controls and capital flight. Not 10 years later, we actually deregulated and made this stuff easier. And it's all in the name of what they call free trade. When you hear that term free trade, you want to ask free for who? Because free trade is anything but. And it has had really negative economic consequences. We're told as staunch fiscal conservators that free trade is great, but I think it's time to question those assumptions. If you really look at the history of free trade and who's benefited from it, it's not such free trade may not necessarily be free because it comes at a very heavy cost.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't free to any of the people that did banking at any of these banks.
Yeah, and I've talked about this before, but that's one of the main reasons you saw this multinational criminal syndicate go after Donald Trump so hugely from day one, is he was canceling these free trade deals, saying these are ridiculous. And that's when I thought, we talked about this on my channel. Yes. Like the investor state dispute settlements, but yeah, it all ties together. Well, a couple more notes on First American bank shares. Lance, so FMBC orchestrated the purchase of First American bank shares. First American bank shares would become what's called Financial General Bank shares. They tried it, and the regulators canceled it, and then came back 3 years later using 15 Arab investors as nominees, basically shell corporations. And that's how BCCI got their big bank in Washington, D.C. And this is the guy who orchestrated it.
Well, and in the book that I was reading about this, it said that the, how do you say his name? Farone? Rashad?
That's a good guess.
Okay, so the Saudi banker who purchased National Bank of Georgia for BCCI from Bert Lance later sold it to First American Bank And they, in order to do that, because it was a Georgia bank, they had to hire a Georgian legislature called Charles Jones to work around Georgia legislators in order to even make that purchase available.
No suitcases full of cash involved in that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, and also understand that this bank that Bert Lance owned held mortgages for Jimmy Carter's peanut farm. So they basically bought the president.
Yeah, and this is the same president that, was famous for the Midnight Massacre, where they fired 1,000 CIA agents.
So you wonder, and I do, because I have a completely different opinion of Jimmy Carter after doing all of this research, and he is not by far a good guy. So don't get me started on that. But I do believe he had a conscience, which is very different than most of the people that we deal with in these stories. And he very much, as you say, Midnight Massacre, fires over 1,000 CIA officers, because what he found out was that they were on the bad side of everything that they ever did. The things that they said were the good guys were always the bad guys. And the ones that they told us were the bad guys were always the good guys. And Jimmy Carter made foreign aid contingent upon human rights, which means none of the people that the CIA wanted funded was going to get any funding because they're the ones killing everybody. And so that type of foreign aid policy, foreign policy in general, went over like a lead balloon with the CIA. And so they very much did not like Jimmy Carter. And I wouldn't find it at all surprising, this is completely hypothetical, that they would have targeted this bank, not just because Bert Lance was financially insolvent, and he was, and he had already put out the word that he was looking to sell, so he's a target, but the fact that Jimmy Carter's loans for his family peanut empire is held in this bank had to make it an even more appealing target, because they could have called his loans.
It's a nice, good old boy network. Yeah, fun stuff. I got another character if you're ready to move on from Mr. Lance, unless you have any more color.
Yeah, just one other thing. During the same time, because I'm a Floridian, I did find it very interesting that you have in Florida, when all of this stuff is going on, you have Florida governors Bob Graham, who, by the way, ends up on the Senate Intel Committee from 01 to 03. What happened in 01?
I seem to remember some planes not landing properly.
And this Bob Graham is involved in all of this shit in Florida and the banking. And he ends up on the Senate Intel Committee that basically whitewashed that plane's not landing properly. And then you have Bob Martinez, who takes over after Graham. And he was the mayor in Tampa when all of that drug stuff was happening down here. Oh, and then he serves as George H.W. Bush's drug czar. So wait a minute.
Well, at least we won the war on drugs.
Yeah, because of that Bob Martinez being the drug czar for Bush, the CIA director, who orchestrated the drug trafficking. And you also have, at that time, let's see, Jeb Bush was Secretary of Commerce in Florida. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I got to go back to something you said a little bit ago when you're talking about Carter, because it triggered a memory for me.
I triggered you?
Yeah, I'm triggered. You said that basically he demanded that there be some kind of human rights connection to any of our foreign aid. Interestingly enough, what springs up shortly thereafter, all these NGOs that are running around the world ostensibly to do good for all these humanitarian purposes, and they became conduits for the State Department, USAID, money laundering. They were able to do things under the guise of human rights that the CIA couldn't do openly.
Correct. So they went around Jimmy Carter's back and figured out another conduit, which they did in every scenario. Congress said no money to Angola. They figured out another way to do it through Israel. They gave foreign aid to Israel. They sent it to South Africa, the weapons, and then it came into Angola. Same thing with Iran-Contra. That was illegal. Congress said not to do it. And they just figured out using Israel again, another way to use weapons into Iran to basically break the law.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of little money laundering schemes that go along with the NGOs when they're operating internationally. There's all kinds of fun ways to funnel money back to yourself tax-free, but that's not today's lesson either. So I'm glad you brought up the human rights issues that Carter brought up, because okay, that sounds fair. We can work within that that frame, and they're actually more effective. And that's why you see these countries like Hungary, and not just Hungary, but we've talked about a bunch of these. There are countries all over Eurasia that are now implementing laws to basically kick these NGOs out of their countries. They're basically implementing their own version of FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act, an act that we have here in the United States. We're trying to put countries all over. Georgia's the big one we did the show on. And our State Department is trying to orchestrate a coup in Georgia.
Armenia, Azerbaijan, all of them want to have that protection and keep George Soros out. And our State Department is orchestrating coups to make them force feed NGOs into their country.
Because they're trying to pass a law that's almost identical to one that we have on our books.
Yeah, we're allowed to do it. They're not.
Exactly.
And so I do want to transition you to one of your other guys listed. And I think it's funny because I have that guy in my notes. Listen to this. During the investigation that Morgenthau had, there was a guy by the name, he had a fake name. We're just going to call him Witness 2 in the big Morgenthau investigation that said BCCI paid Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, and Carter. BCCI basically owned the Florida bank called Centrust, which is where I got all of when they bought Centrust, all of the people that I mentioned as far as the governors and how they all play into this operation as well as future operation like 9/11 were involved. Charlie Jones and the Farone kept it open an extra year by basically bribing the people in office in Florida at the time when the Florida regulators initially wanted it shut down. And it cost an additional $2 billion of our federal tax dollars to leave it open that 1 year.
This is Kirk. Well, you brought up my name, guy by the name of Andrew Young. And good segue. So those who've done any deep diving into the civil rights movement of the 60s, this name should be familiar. If you paid attention to politics in the 70s and 80s, he's probably familiar as well. But let's just walk through his very interesting and colorful history. So he's best known as a former Atlanta mayor. And what you talked about with BCCI paying him, they were paying him about $50,000 annually to run to his company, Andrew Young Associates, which is ostensibly an international investment company. He first comes on the radar in the early 60s. He's working with MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. What do we know about MLK's connections to any federal agencies?
I don't know. Why don't you tell us?
I have not done the deepest dive on this, but I've seen some reputable people talk about him being an FBI informant for quite some time.
Yeah.
So, and they basically say that the government killed their own asset when they took him out.
Which we've done multiple times.
Of course, you become no longer useful. So he's there. Andrew Young is there. In 1964, he becomes the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is a big civil rights issue. We had a lot of the Southern churches, a lot of these Southern groups getting together on the civil rights. He had a key role in the 1963 Birmingham, and he was also there for the Selma civil rights events, riots, protests, whatever you want to call them. That guy has been there in all of that. So this is not a nobody here. He leverages that up and gets elected to Congress in Georgia in 1972. He immediately joins the Congressional Black Caucus, and this is a freshman congressman from Georgia, and he gets put on not only the very influential Rules Committee, but he gets put on the Banking and Urban Development Committee. Now, that's rather significant. First of all, he doesn't have a whole lot of banking background, or none. When I say not a whole lot, I mean zero that I can see in his background. And yet he's put on the Congress Banking and Urban Development Committee. The urban development's an interesting part of that because that's kind of a new idea that came out of the civil rights. And basically, we're funneling government money to what they would call underprivileged neighborhoods to basically force investment in areas that otherwise capital would not go to. This guy's sitting, on those prestigious committees. So I ask, how does he get that? He's got to be connected to people. Who does he know? And why is this a non-banker sitting on a banking committee?
Well, he also served as the ambassador to the UN.
We're going to get there.
Okay.
We're going to get there.
That was the big connection to me, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that comes up too.
Yeah.
So he serves 3 terms in Congress. And in 1977, Carter names him the ambassador to the United Nations. And he had a short but storied career there. He did a couple of really interesting things. He's basically the guy that put Mugabe in power in Rhodesia. What's going on in Rhodesia, which was, Zimbabwe. It became Zimbabwe. Rhodesia is going through a civil war. And finally, stop me when this sounds familiar. Basically, you have two main sides of the civil war there. There's an election in 1979. And Bishop Abai Muzuriwa wins the 1979 election against Mugabe. Well, Andrew Young, as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, refuses to accept the election results. He describes the election as neo-fascists. The UN Security Council agrees, and they have to have a compromise, something called the Lancaster House Agreement, establishes a new country called Zimbabwe, and they put Mugabe on the throne.
And leading up to that, and after that, you have in South Africa multiple terrorist training camps, i.e. Gladio style, that launches attacks to destabilize that country. Not with the puppet in it, but as they are going through the process of establishing their bona fides as far as being a country, they are completely destabilized, and then they use the destabilization as their excuse on why they pull shit like you just described.
Yeah, and what's Rhodesia/Zimbabwe famous for? That would be their natural resources. And, that's the reason Cecil Rhodes spent a lot of his career developing that. And that's why they named the country after him.
Gold, diamonds.
And for those who don't know, Cecil B. Rhodes, probably one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. The Rhodes Foundation, where you get these Rhodes Scholars, that's a whole show into itself. I've talked about it before, Tavistock Institute. But for the record, Cecil B. Rhodes really believed that it was his mission in life is to help make the world white English. He's one of the biggest racists that ever lived. And he was looking at, racial purification. That's some of his founding principles.
And Cecil Rhodes was a founding member of the Round Table Fabian Society, where we got the first use and discussion of the bedrock of which Gladio was based on. And that is the takeover to basically have a worldwide fascist one world government. That was all birthed under their auspices. And then you find places like it's almost like they tossed a grenade around the world strategically, like in the Middle East, where they set up Israel, in the Far East Middle East, where they set up Pakistan. Taiwan was created eventually out of all after World War II. These are the same people that said we're going to have 3 world wars. And that basically the third one, which is kind of what happened in the immediate aftermath of World War II, it's just a covert war, not an overt war.
Yeah, and this your Roundtable was the predecessor to the American version, which is called the Council of Foreign Relations, which
Correct.
of course was set up by the Rockefellers.
Right.
And
And
the
they
last,
go hand in hand with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is their cousin inside of London.
Outstanding. We should do, well, we've done partial shows on that, but one of the things I do want to do is the Tavistock Institute. And that all ties to this stuff too, but let's leave that for a future show and jump back into our buddy.
But it's very interesting how all of these tentacles that we talk about all stems from the same head. And you cannot escape the creation, as you just mentioned, with Rhodesia and the destabilization process, because it's just another iteration of the same overall strategy from the head. So go ahead.
All right, we're sitting there talking about Mr. Andrew Young. He did a couple other fun things while in his brief tenure as an ambassador to the United Nations. He was involved in negotiations for the creation of the Palestinian state in 1979. And U.S. policy was not to discuss a Palestinian state. He has a meeting with a PLO rep in New York at the home of the Kuwaiti ambassador. And news of this meeting is leaked. It was leaked by Mossad. And it was a scandal because the U.S. official foreign policy was not to meet with PLO, not to talk about a Palestinian state or any of that. He was forced to resign because of that. But this is a guy that Mossad took out very quickly when he overstepped the line.
So incredibly interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I left a pause there because I knew you'd have a comment on that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, now we got to talk about, who created the Palestinian the PLO and the other various factions there. And those are all, either CIA or Mossad creations in the first place.
Correct.
It's a hot topic today because of what's going on with Hamas and Netanyahu over in Israel. Netanyahu continued to fund Hamas because he didn't want them
correct
unifying with the main Palestinian Authority. The division, the threat is how Netanyahu and the Israeli versions of the neocons, that's how they stay in power. Without that threat, they're gone pretty quickly.
And what I find interesting about that, and I have to keep reminding people because this was a new, I've never heard anybody else talk about this. When we talk about all of those negotiations, of which, obviously you were talking about the leak, most people have never heard of Crypto AG. And Crypto AG was an encryption device that was sold by a company called Crypto AG to basically over 100 countries, state departments, or their version of it. And it was to be fielded in all of the embassies from that country around the world. So in Washington, D.C., there would have been at every one of those 100 embassies that had bought from Crypto AG this encryption device, a terminal for them to send and receive communications from their respective countries' foreign office. That entire system had a back door that was open to the CIA and the German version of the CIA called the BND. And so at all times from 1945 until 2020, when Donald Trump basically bankrupted the company and it went out of business, there had been backdoor encrypted software worldwide at over 100 countries. And all but Israel that I found, all of the Middle East countries had this software installed. Egypt, Jordan, the PLO. So the entire time that they were here doing the negotiations, no matter where they were at, the US and Germany had the ability to eavesdrop on every single cable that was transmitted worldwide for these over 100 countries. Iran had it, all of South America had it. So many countries in South America had it that they actually set up a substation on a military base in Panama to handle the traffic.
So it brings up the question, when Mossad decides to leak a report about the U.S. ambassador to the UN, are they spying on a U.S. ambassador, or were they spying on the other entity, the PLO? So, what are the
Yes.
rules?
Can we just say yes?
Yes. All of the above? Multiple choice question?
Yeah. So none of the, and keep in mind, James Angleton at the CIA was both the Rome Vatican person and Israel. He ran both desks and had access to all of this information.
You mean the same James Jesus Angleton, who's the guy who flew across the country to gather all the papers and destroy them the day that Alan Dulles died? That James Jesus Angleton? Yeah. He's one of the all-time greats. He really is. He's on the Hall of Fame.
Well, that's the reason why he has like 3 memorials in Israel.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Yeah. With a guy named James Jesus. Fun last little bit to bring our buddy home. So he has to resign in shame because you cannot upset the Zionists during those negotiations. Resigns in disgrace. 2 years later, he gets elected to be the mayor of Atlanta, and was really well known for bringing in about $70 billion of private investment comes into Atlanta while he was the mayor. We don't have to get too deep into that, but if you understand how municipal finance goes, the whole process of bringing in companies to, your municipality, your county, your state is a giant corrupt scheme of bribery and tax breaks. And this is the perfect guy to do that. So you got a guy who was once grew up as a civil rights marcher, ended up being, about as corrupt as anybody, and an employee, as we said, of BCCI. And that's all I have. That's what I brought to the table on these 3.
Okay. Well, I think that's definitely a good solid show. That's a lot, actually. As we stated earlier, it is very important to set the stage for some of the connections that we will cover probably in show number 4. But what I want to do next week is cover the foreign actors in a little bit more depth, like what you mentioned, a couple of them, but they have some very interesting history as well, to include Betty and the UAE, not just the people involved in the UAE, but the country itself, so that you can understand why it's so incredibly important, like the relationship that Pakistan had with Afghanistan and with India, for that matter, and how all of that was woven together. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time deep diving into some of the foreign players that were the face, because there's ties not just to these foreign players. As you mentioned, the banker from Saudi was the guy that also was the intermediary with the Bush family. He had a large presence in Houston. He had a guy there that basically did the interfacing of the Saudi oil with the Texas oil. That was a known CIA agent that retrofitted out all of the Saudi jets. And so we're just going to, and Baker, and, he ends up being Reagan's Secretary of Treasury while all of the scandal is going on. So there's a lot more players here. And we're going to tie a few of those together with their American counterparts next show. And then we're going to work on kind of presenting the whole operation in what may be a single show, but maybe just kind of like the last 2 shows of showing, just walking through some of their operations and how devastating it was, not just because they had branches everywhere.
And what I'd like to do, when you start talking about bringing in some of the international players, the first guy to jump to mind is Giovanni Falcone, who was a prosecutor from Palermo who helped bring the whole thing down just as much as anybody. One of the biggest anti-mafia prosecutors of all time. To talk about him, you need to really set the stage, do a little bit of history of how regulation and deregulation of financial industries have been conducted pretty much since the 1940s or 50s, because there's a story to be told there. And you see how the players involved have to shift their strategy as certain things change. And the background of it really tees up what BCCI became and how. But it'll tie exactly into, it's the international story. It is definitely not an American story by any stretch. It ties into what you said we want to do for next week. So we'll probably plan on a longer show next week.
Okay.
Because I need at least 30 minutes to do that history.
That would be perfect. So that's a date.
It's on my calendar.
All right. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. We will be back at noon next Thursday for part 3. And thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Thanks, Brady, for
cheers. Cheers. It's a lot of fun. We got to a little banter back and forth. And as always, I got to learn a few new tidbits.
Always. I definitely always learn from you. So see you guys next week. Thanks for being here.